Hey everyone, welcome to our Politics 3330 exam assignment walkthrough. We are looking right now at doing our final exam, which comes at the end of a 15-week semester where we've looked at a number of different topics, from realism through to gender in part 1 of the course. And in part 2 of the course, we have addressed some slightly more esoteric topics, but they remain important theories and part of the sort of story, if you will, of international relations. International relations, of course, tells itself a lot of stories about who and what it is, and our real point this semester has been to try to figure out a little bit about those stories. The discipline identifies itself as a discipline composed of debates between these stories. There's the debate between realism and liberalism. There's the debate between liberalism, realism, the so-called rationalists that we talked about before, and the constructivists. And then there's a debate between all three of those and the rest, in the sense that all three of those theories are the anarchy theories. But as we saw when we looked at the gender stuff, there are many who think that the traditional questions of international relations should not be exhausted by a preoccupation with whether or not wars happen in this or that set of conditions. The gender theorists put on the table for us a richness or a sense of a wider horizon of the questions that could be asked within IR. Now, as I've said to you before, there's a good response to that in some ways as well, because while gender theory does good work for us in terms of expanding the horizon of questions we can ask, and that horizon, I think, in my opinion, should be wider than simply the question of war and peace. But the gender theorists that we looked at also insisted, as a sort of an add-on to that the traditional questions were based on an agenda that was more or less masculinist in its nature, that saw security, that is to say, in terms that were decidedly not the terms that would be chosen were the discipline to be dominated by an agenda that took as central or as important the interests of women. We looked at the case study of women in Darfur, in Sudan, for example, and we determined, I think, with no small measure of confidence that there's a good point being made there, that sovereignty and the traditional notions of security, the security of the state, did and do in places like that come at the expense of definitions of security that women might hold more dear. So without any shadow of a doubt, there's a good point being made by the gender theorists in that sense. A wider definition of security can be really revelatory for us as scholars of international politics. Moving on from that, in the second half of the course, we addressed a number of interesting theories that kind of took that cue from the gender approach, and tried to look at other facets of the way in which the terms of international relations today might be seen to be marginalizing to specific groups of people. The globalization theory that we looked at took as its focus the question of whether or not people like Francis Fukuyama were right to say, as they did, that neoliberal consumerism was the end of history. Neo-Marxism went a little step further and asked us to kind of revisit Marxism as a way of perhaps fixing the problems associated with globalization theory, but in a manner that respected the wide range of struggles, identity-based struggles, I suppose you'd say, that seem to have emerged in the aftermath of the 1960s, or what's sometimes referred to as the turn of the New Left. Now, Hart and Negri are not identity theorists. They're not interested in drawing straight equivalencies between the struggle of the proletariat, the struggle of women, the struggle of racial minorities, etc. At the end of the day, they are Marxists. But what they do want to argue, I think, is that the multitude, the liberated mass of humanity, if it ever is to emerge, Marx used to call this, of course, the proletariat. Hart and Negri don't use that term for a very specific reason, because they're sensitive to the fact that people today struggle under many, many different flags, many different banners. When they protest in the street, it's not as the working class, shall we say. It's as any one of a number of other things, but sometimes still the working class. So respecting this diversity and breadth, Hart and Negri do, however, as Marxists of a manner of speaking, want to bring us back to this question of how these struggles intend to achieve the kind of material advancement that they believe is necessary in the world for humanity to flourish, without recognizing the need to confront capitalism. And so this is Cynthia Weber's challenge for Hart and Negri then. Well, can you have this struggle, be it against capitalism, be it against any other regime of power, and leave yourself so thin in terms of the narrative of who or what the subject is that's struggling for that emancipation? Now, for Hart and Negri, that's not a problem, right? They think it's perfectly fine to make this claim, as I'm making, that these different groups, while they're struggling for recognition as women, or recognition as a racial minority, or recognition as gay, or what have you, that they still need to contend with capitalism at the end of the day, because while you can have racist modes of capitalism, or rather, let me rephrase, excuse me, while you can have racist modes of socialism, there's no such thing as a non-racist mode of capitalism, if that makes any sense. What I'm trying to sort of suggest there is that the goals which Black Lives Matter or women's liberation movements seek, in a material sense, cannot really be accomplished within capitalism, because ultimately those movements are not just about recognition of the rights of those groups, but ultimately about the striving that all human beings share for a kind of a certain material empowerment in the world, in order to flourish. Because at the end of the day, and this is Hart and Negri's point, this is why they are much more interested in the term multitude, a multitude of singularities, than any particular banner or flag for a specific group. Because the multitude can encompass this point that is because the multitude can encompass, at the end of the day, this vital point that we are not just an identity, right? We're never just black or gay or a woman or what have you. We are an individual with a subjectivity, a soul, if you will, as unique as our thumbprint, right? Our fingerprint. And the question is, how do you liberate that individual? For neo-Marxism, that's the question. Moving further along, environmentalism presents a kind of a similar argument again. Again, our cue here is to think about how feminism, the gender-based approach, confronted the anarchy-based approaches and said, no, there are all these broader questions we can be asking here about groups, about subjectivities, about marginal figures, about experiences in global politics that simply aren't addressed within the traditional theories. And the word security is important here because, as the gender-based theorists were arguing, traditional militaristic notions of security simply didn't do a good enough job at speaking to the experiences of security and insecurity that these other groups, these other cross-sections of humanity were experiencing. Again, going back to our story of the woman in Darfur, what are Hart and Negri arguing at the end of the day? Only that our material security at the end of the day is necessary. Environmentalism brings it forward again, right? It's about climate change. It's about the fact that humanity cannot be the only center of our theory. Hart and Negri, I suppose, would respect this to a degree, but the environmentalists many of them arguing that we need a green-centered theory. And we looked at a number of different debates catalyzed by that proposition, including whether or not Al Gore's approach, which seems to be very much a green theory, actually at the end of the day turned out to be not so much of a green theory at all. And what we, I think, concluded was that in order to actually do something about global warming, it may be that a green theory is a theory that includes a lot of humanity at the end of the day as well. This separation, this distinction between man and nature may not be as useful for saving the planet as once thought. In other words, just simply doing less of human things is not really going to save the day. It's not like a Pareto efficiency equation, or if you will, a zero-sum game. If humans are doing better, then the environment is doing worse. If the environment's doing better, humans are doing worse. Possibly a very radically different approach was necessary. And then finally, in terms of anarchism and the idea of the 99%, we looked at, again, a set of experiences, this time through the concept of debt, brought to us by David Graeber, and the idea of life in debt. This, of course, is the complaint, the plight of those who took to the streets under the banner of the Occupy movement. So there we had a complaint about the meaninglessness of a life when you're saddled with so much debt, just to try to keep your end of the bargain, right? Our societal contract, for want of a better term, made us a promise and said that, if you go to school, you get those good grades, you get a good degree, there'll be a job for you on the other side. What we didn't know, though, was that in the small print was that if we got that job, got those good grades, we'd be so saddled by debt on the other side that we'd need not just our main job, but a job on the side just to take care of the debt payments. And of course, that's not really a dignified way to live. We as human beings tend to be happier when we're working maybe about 40 hours a week and not much more than that, right? That's a dignified existence, It seems to most people that, on the basis of a 40-hour working week, you should at the very least be able to put a roof over your head and some bread on the table. And when we're struggling to do even that, because we're so burdened with debt, our incomes might be great, but we're paying off an awful lot of debt. So we're kind of putting off the day where we're comfortable into the infinite future, maybe into advanced age. By the time you've paid off your car, your house, your education, the cost of your wedding, the cost of raising your first child, the cost of taking care of your elderly parents, there's obviously a lot of our human experience that's left to be desired. And this is, of course, what the banks don't consider, and this is what we looked at in our lecture that day. This is what we looked at in our lecture that day. We are trying to explain to the banks, we are trying to explain to the financial system that debt isn't just a mathematical equation. It's not just a certain amount of cash that we borrowed. There are contexts within debt. Debt is accrued. And we need as a society to have a serious conversation about the way debt is treated. The stories of those who are in debt, the reason why they went into debt, are hugely varied, and the human need that people have for debt is hugely varied. So we need to respect that, I think, and that's what the anarchists were trying to sort of suggest there. But beyond that story about debt, there's also another angle on this, which is, what do we do about it? And for that question, we look at the way Katniss Everdeen tried to resolve her debt in the movie The Hunger Games. She seemed to have a kind of an Occupy Wall Street-like stance towards the debt that her district owed to the Capitol. Excuse me 1 second here while I turn this off. The debt that she owed to the Capitol. Well, it was a very Occupy Wall Street-like critique at the end of the day, but we certainly had to stop and take note of the fact that, at least in the first film of that trilogy, it's not clear that Katniss's agenda is anything other than taking care of herself and her immediate loved ones. She's not a hero. She's not an anarchist hero, to be specific. And so, in the end, the question was, would the movie have a commentary on the idea of the 99%? Did our desire to fight debt automatically constitute us as part of the 99%? Was the demand to be done with debt, or to be able to at least contextualize debt, sufficient to make us part of the 99% as a political movement? And the answer, apparently, at least in this film, was no. So that's a quick survey of the 4 topics that we've looked at this semester. Now we just need to talk a little bit about the exam, folks. And the thing I want to say is that the exam should be submitted by Thursday, May 9th, 2019. Aside from that, I'd really love if everyone would pay close attention to the nature of the exam, the specific parameters that the exam assignment contain. It came to my attention in the midterm that not everyone, in my view, read the assignment. And maybe that's understandable because the assignment is a little bit long. Maybe it contains a lot of details. Maybe we left our work on the assignment to the last minute. Whatever the case may be, it is up to you to make sure that you are living up to the expectations that are set out in the assignment. So I thought with this video that we could go through it together and just be clear about what we're being asked to do. So you're just picking one question, very similar to the midterm. It should be no less than 7 pages long. It should be no more than 8 pages long. You pick one movie from the lists available at the back of the assignment, and each list, of course, will contain, as it did in the midterm, a sort of a middle-length list of movies that you can pick. And of course, you can pick your own film if you think you've got a winner that I haven't been able to think of that would really suit the myth. But if you are going to pick your own movie, I really recommend that you email me first, just so we can knock it back and forth, and you can persuade me that this is actually something that would be worth taking on. I do not recommend paddling your own canoe on this one and going off and doing your own movie without at least discussing it with me first. Because it could be that even despite best intentions, you may have misinterpreted the theory, or you may have misinterpreted the film. Also, we have a tendency, I think, sometimes to get a little enamored with a film, and we have to remember that the goal of this assignment is not to write a movie review. This is a political science class. We're looking at these movies for the political models that they embody, the political models that are inherent in their plots. And we have to try to respect that. This class is fun. Watching the movies is fun. Try to avoid the temptation of turning your assignment into a movie review. I'll give you some hints and tips on how to do that in just a second. So, how can we avoid turning our assignment into a movie review? I think one of the key ways that we can do that is pay close attention to the basic argumentative structure adopted by Cynthia Weber in her chapters. Her methodology varies a little bit, but she always tends to use the same basic approach. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see this. Just look at the fact that she uses section headings in her chapters. The section headings are always similar. Opens up. What does the myth say? There's always a section in there called "What does the myth say?" I strongly urge you to use similar section headings and use sections of roughly equal length, all as are in the same manner that Cynthia Weber does in her assignments. Most of her sections are the same length. And that's important, right? Because what you see from this is that she is not turning her chapters into reviews of movies that she just happens to like, right? She's devoting sufficient weight to the analysis of a theory as she is to the analysis of the film. And then, of course, she revisits the theory and the film later on in the chapter. So I think you guys should do that too. Use section headings. The section headings should, broadly speaking, emulate the section headings used by Cynthia Weber. And your sections should be also of roughly equivalent length. Now remember, you have 7 to 8 pages to play around with here. So that means you'll need to be disciplined, right? Pay close attention to how much space, how many words rather, you're putting into each section. Use your word count function in your word processor, be it Microsoft Word or whatever, to make sure you're staying on track of how long those sections are. And the student that can come back to me with an essay that has section headings and that the sections are roughly of equal length, I think is going to have a much better chance of demonstrating to me, the grader, that they've taken Cynthia Weber's structure seriously. So let's have a look at that structure now. You see we have it modeled here in the assignment. There's an introduction. There's a what does the myth say section. Then there's a discussion of the film. Then there's a critique. And then finally, there's a sort of a idea of what lessons we might draw, or a conclusion, so to speak, right? Now, that's not... what I'm outlining here is very close to what Cynthia Weber has in her individual chapters. You guys need to have headings in your exam that reflect these sections. Take a look closely at Cynthia Weber's chapters and see the headings that she uses. See how, if possible, you can emulate the headings and the development of the sections, as I'm arguing here, as she does. And as you see here, I've even put in how long it should be in your paper, approximately 20% of your paper. So we're breaking your paper basically into 5 sections. And a good student is going to take this part of it very seriously and make sure that about 20% of your pages would be encompassed or reflected in the way your paper is structured. 20% blocks is what I'm trying to suggest, excuse me. So that's 20% of your paper would be an introduction. What does that mean in practical terms? It means about a page and a third. What does the myth say? About a page and a third. Film, about a page and a third. Critique, about a page and a third. And then conclusion, about a page and a third. What I've noticed is that students tend to really sort of give short shrift on the conclusion, give short shrift on an introduction. These are important parts of your argument. Introductions are important. They need to be considered. Conclusions are important. They need to be rigorous. They need to actually state what we've learned. What does the myth say? It needs to do the work. You need to be able to show reference to the theories. Use citations, elaborate with quotes from the assigned readings, your views on what the myth functions are in the theory that you're trying to elaborate on. The film, we can cite from the film. We can give quotes from the film. You don't really need to give a citation for the film. If you want, you can give a timestamp, but there's no point in putting the film in your bibliography. There's no point in citing a movie that is already implicitly and obviously the subject of your essay from the very title that you're giving your essay. So by all means, in parentheses, give a timestamp if you want, like 1 hour, 20 seconds. You can just simply, 1:20, something like that. But a citation's not necessary. A basic plot outline, a basic summary is important. But more than a summary, we're looking for how the film supports the theory. And you don't have a lot of space to work with here, so you will need to be disciplined. If you're finding that you do need more space, you can probably trade off a little bit, maybe get up closer to 2 pages. But you just want to be careful that your paper does not grow any longer than 8 pages total. So if you are going to extend your film discussion section, don't go over 2 pages. You probably want to keep it right about there, okay? Next, section 4, then the critique. Cynthia Weber revisits the film and checks whether, having argued and demonstrated the outline and then having argued how it supports the theory, she looks at how it might also be interpreted as inconsistent, or in what ways it's inconsistent, what other possible interpretations of the plot might be offered. And whether or not the film reinforces any kind of subconscious ideologies that make the plot more believable to the audience. So, for example, we've looked at subconscious ideologies all through this course, whether it's the gender sort of topic, where we looked at how women, single career women, in their late 30s can be represented as somehow, believable monsters by the way music, by the way lighting, by the way certain plot narratives all kind of like contrive to set up the character as, the woman that made the bad choices, as opposed to becoming what a woman is supposed to become, which is a responsible and decent housewife. Finally, section 5, you will want to look at unconscious ideologies. Again, how we might be able to learn lessons from your discussion in the previous 4 sections, and how we might reform, how we might change our view of the world to take heed of the discoveries that you've encountered in your own research between the theory and the film. So how do we assess, how do we grade your paper? We have basically 4 metrics, and these are the metrics that will be reflected in the rubric of your exam. So when you finally get your grade, it will be broken down along these criteria. So what are we looking for? 7 to 8 pages of reasoned academic engagement with the assigned readings. So that means we're looking for 7 to 8 pages of good faith, rigorous academic engagement with the assigned readings. Another way of sort of thinking about this criteria is that it's not simply a movie review, right? That you are at least trying to relate it to the assigned readings. The second criteria is that the paper offers an original and insightful critique of one of the above mentioned myths using a movie of your choice. Obviously a movie drawn from the list at the end of the assignment here, while following Cynthia Weber's structure and method. That is really important, I think. I'm trying to emphasize this because I didn't emphasize it enough, I think, for the midterm. A lot of people didn't fully follow the flow of Cynthia Weber's approach, and that's the reason why, for example, I'm emphasizing equal length sections with section headings. Thirdly, the paper, this is sort of just more like technical logistics, 12-point Times New Roman font. Some people didn't do that for the midterm. Double-spaced. The paper is written in a manner befitting academic writing. That means that it is proofread. It is overly free of, it is proofread. It is free of overly general or vague statements. It is well organized with coherent paragraphs and transitions. It's free of typos or grammatical errors. For members of the class for whom writing is difficult, be that because English is not their first language or because that is just happens to be something they struggle with, I would strongly recommend going to the Writing Center on campus to get someone to peer review it. I would strongly recommend having perhaps someone who is skilled with grammar and spelling to proofread it if you cannot make it to the Writing Center, perhaps a family relative or a good friend. I think this is important. Leaving your paper to the last minute will make that very difficult for you, by the way. And then finally, in our rubric, the paper offers supporting argument and citations from class text. This is an incredibly important part of it, so important, in fact, that it is a separate criteria worth 25%, all on its own. In the midterm exam, I noticed that a lot of students, I won't say a lot of students, but some students, by the way they were citing the arguments, left me at least with the impression that they hadn't bought the textbook, for example. If you don't have the Cynthia Weber textbook, get it now. Get it ASAP. It is not going to serve you well to try to take on this final exam without access to the textbook. It's very, very obvious reading the exam if the student is only engaging with the supplemental texts which are available to students via Blackboard. It's incredibly obvious at the end of the day when students don't have the readings of from Cynthia Weber at their disposal. So I do strongly encourage students to make sure they've read Cynthia Weber, make sure they're citing from Cynthia Weber, not just the freely distributed texts that were made available via Blackboard. Students are encouraged to do individual independent research. They may want to go to the campus library to look for some extra sources. You can look in the Cynthia Weber text, you can look in the Dan Dresner text for suggestions about where to go on your further reading. I think that's going to have a hugely beneficial impact on the grade. But whatever you do, if you are going to the library, recognize that putting the icing on the cake before the cake is baked is a mistake, right? Don't put too much flair on your paper before the fundamental ingredients are in place, okay? You want to concentrate on getting that cake baked, and that means sticking with Cynthia Weber and the texts, the supplemental texts that she's referring to, which I have provided for you on Blackboard, before you go off doing extra reading. Extra reading is really for the student that believes they are ready to excel in the course. Okay? Here's a warning that's very, very important about plagiarism. It's important that you understand what plagiarism is. It's important, or you can find that a mistake will end up putting you in a bad position. It can happen that we inadvertently forget to cite something. Usually that's seen as a good faith mistake, and it's apparent because the reading in question has been cited elsewhere in the paper. So we can maybe forgive one minor mistake or two minor mistakes, but when we find that there are whole paragraphs or whole sentences plagiarized, pulled directly from something like Wikipedia or another online source without any citation, it's usually an extremely red flag. And when it's found, it can lead to prosecution. Similarly, for this paper, again, just to sort of re-emphasize, answers focusing on the movie, i.e. writing a movie review without developing theoretical significance, can be poorly received. Beyond that, folks, then, it's just a list of films that you can look at. I've done some thinking about the films that you can look at here, and I hope you'll find this list to be edifying. If there's a movie that you can think of that you think should be on this list, let me know. I would be very, very interested to know what you think can work for this list. I would be interested to know as well if if your paper can sort of elaborate the theoretical significance of another film. So do feel encouraged to suggest other films. But if you are going to do it, run it by me first. I won't get into this next part here because it's really just sort of a list of hints that I have already kind of delineated in my introductory remarks to this video. You may find these hints helpful. I hope you will. I encourage you to read them depending on what you've picked. The environment one's a little bit short, but certainly useful, I hope. Finally, at the back, there's just a list of essay do's and don'ts. Don't plagiarize. Don't simply summarize your notes. Plan. Your opening sentence in the first paragraph should define the problem you were tackling. In other words, you should have something like a thesis statement. In this paper, I will argue that... ... whatever it is you're going to argue. I would take seriously this point here. Avoid banal statements that do not tackle your exact concern. Avoid waffle. In other words, don't open up with, in our country, we have a problem with blah, 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 or something. Get to the point. It's a terrible sign usually in a paper when a student opens with waffle, right? With just empty words. It shows right away that the student is unclear about what they're doing in the assignment, hasn't done research, doesn't have confidence. So get right in there. This paper will argue that. Elaborate it. Also, a really important point is do not write in the first person if you can all avoid it. Sometimes it is absolutely necessary, but we try to use it as sparingly as possible, and I'm quite serious about that. You should not write in a voice that presumes an I or a we. So, in high school, we're often taught to write as if we're making a speech, as in, I believe, or in our country, we, right? But, interestingly, in our country, you're sort of presuming the nationality of the reader of your paper, but the reader of your paper could be from any other country in the world, right? It's not, obviously I'm Irish, so I'm not even from the United States. So try to avoid in our country, we are some such, okay? We're writing objectively like a scientist in the third person, okay? It is often said that, right? Or one may say. Such phrasings have the unfortunate effect of implying that you are not being objective or that your audience by definition from your country. Yes, again, it implies a sort of a bias. Now, one final point here. Do not be afraid to disagree with what you imagine to be your professor's views. Teachers often play devil's advocate to draw the students out, to engage them, to provoke them to maybe start a fight, in the classroom. A productive academic fight, of course, not a fist fight. But this means that you may have heard things from your professor that give you a sense of what their point of view is. Well, you may be wrong because the professor could be playing devil's advocate with you. So what this means is, don't you be afraid to also play devil's advocate. You could take a position in a paper that you actually don't agree with. Maybe it's an experimental position for you, just to try to think something through that you've never had a chance to think through before. This is especially interesting because the 4 possible case studies for the end of our semester, the four theories, that is to say, for the end of our semester, are all kind of a bit more oriented towards, shall we say, anti-status quo frames of reference. And that means, of course, that the second half of the course is very different to the first half, where we did actually look at 3 status quo theories, or pro-status quo theories, or pro-anarchy, for want of a better term. They're not actually pro-anarchy, really. But they're taking anarchy seriously as a problem, is what I mean. Whereas the others say maybe anarchy doesn't need to be taken seriously as a problem. We should be looking at other things too. This means, in a sense, that the second half of the course could be seen as covering theories that are more radical, progressive, what have you. Okay, well, this is an opportunity to engage with some new thinking then for some of you, right? Conversely, those of you who are more liberal had to engage with those more conservatively oriented theories in the first half of the course, and things are going to be balanced out that way for us, right? My usual position on this kind of question is that I don't tell students what to think. The syllabus doesn't tell students what to think. The book, Cynthia Weber, does not tell students what to think. The responsibility you have is to apply yourself, to study, to know, to learn what the arguments are, not to necessarily say whether they're good or bad. Of course, you're welcome to those views and you're welcome to engage with them, but your primary responsibility is to know what you're talking about. And all of the theories that we've looked at in this course are part of the core story and narrative of international relations. And so they have their place in the sort of family tree of the way we study international politics. So I just wanted to end on that note because I think it's important to be able to, as academics, as students, see the value in engaging with ideas that we don't necessarily agree with. And that's not, even after we've engaged with them, we still don't have to agree with them, but we have to know them, okay? This is so important, especially in this day and age. Okay, guys, this was fun. Thank you very much indeed for watching. I hope it was useful for you. And I look forward to reading your manuscripts. Thanks very much.